Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is City Talk. They're all there. The families. Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese. The mobsters. Lucky Luciano, Paul Castellano, John Gotti. The Bull, the Chin, Three Fingers. The scams, the shakedowns and rubouts. Rudy Giuliani and Tom Dewey, too. They're all here in the book, Five Families, The Rise, Decline, and Resurgence of America's Most Powerful Mafia Empires. And the author is Selwyn Rabb, longtime reporter for the New York Times, and before that an investigative reporter for the World Telegram, reporter for Newsweek, NBC, NET, and then the Times. And a lot of your investigative stuff was really before you got to the Times. This book is, it's got to be the gold standard in organized crime nonfiction. It is, despite its size, it's really a page turner. How did you get all this inside stuff?
Well, just partly my own brilliance, but I've been collecting notes for over 40 years. In fact, one of the ways I even started on this, I wasn't that interested in the mob when I began my journalism career in New York in the early 60s. In fact, I was covering education news, why Johnny can't read.
Different form of corruption.
Right.
No, go ahead.
What happened was, very simply, there was a major school construction scandal, which people had forgotten about.
Right.
And I started looking into it. And what turned out was you had the mafia behind a lot of these companies that were providing filthy schools, collapsing roofs, and shaking down the city. And when I went to officials and said, why don't you go after these guys? They said, no, if we do that, the whole construction program will stop. They're too important. They're too powerful. Leave them alone. And as a young reporter in the 60s, anyone who had eyes and ears, every stone you turned up, there was the mafia. Whether it was judicial problems, whether it was corrupt judges, whether who was getting fake parking passes, everything. Construction, food, the Fulton Fish Market. So you had to be blind. And yet the editors didn't want to go after these guys.
Not only didn't the editors want to go after them, the cops didn't want to go after them. The public officials didn't want to go after them. Why? I mean, I can understand the corrupt elements of the police, but it was a general ignoring of it. The FBI totally ignored it.
The FBI was more responsible than anyone else. But the point was they were looked upon as amiable rogues. That they weren't predatory criminals. They weren't involved in muggings. They weren't killing people in the streets. They were bumping each other off.
This is romance.
And I heard this from a high official, a very high official in the Koch administration when I was looking into the Fulton Fish Market in the 80s. He said, if we crack down, what's going to happen? Best restaurants in New York won't have fish.
Oh my God. So everybody knows.
Leave them alone. You know, it's a way of doing business in New York. That was the point. Same thing with the garbage, private garbage collection. All they said was, nobody else will come in. If anybody else comes in, they'll foul it up.
So there's this, first of all, the romanticization of it. I mean, it's in the movies, it's in the popular culture, it's in the literature, but also it's the fact of their power really just sort of scared everybody off.
They were the invisible government in New York with invisible taxes. They were cheating us on everything, the clothes we wore, the apparels, the garbage collection, your rent because of the construction industry. They inflated prices down the line.
You're talking about tens of billions of dollars a year.
Tens? Hundreds of
I'm sorry, hundreds of billions.
Don't underestimate.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But the point was, the complaints were they didn't have the legal tools to go after them. It was very hard. The hierarchs, the big bosses were immune. What do you get them on? They never pulled a trigger. They never beaten anybody up. They were giving the orders through relays.
Sure.
So the point very simply was, how do you go after these guys? How do you go after the hierarchies?
Okay, let's take a step back, because one of the true organizational geniuses in America in the 20th century is Lucky Luciano. I never realized it. He's a case study in leadership and management. Describe what he does in the early 1930s.
He invented the modern mafia. What had happened, two people are major cogs behind the Mafia. Strangely enough, one of them was Benito Mussolini, who was the first Italian dictator or first Italian head of state, who went after the Mafia very seriously in the 1920s when he came to power. And what that led to was a lot of exodus of young mafiosi who saw that the handwriting on the wall there. People were being held in cages and sent away for life or shot and killed. So a lot of them came here. Big names like Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, all these future people who went into the
All-Stars, the Hall of Fame.
The Pantheon, right. They came over. And what had happened in the 20s was Prohibition.
Right.
And what changed these loosely organized gangs, not just the Italians, but the Jews and the Irish, even the WASPs, who saw the immense profits in Prohibition, bootlegging. And they became, overnight, they had to be pretty good organizational geniuses to handle everything, to import it, to manufacture it, to distribute it.
Sell it.
They became executives instead of street thugs. They had to have some know-how, some savvy. And what happened, but there was a lot of infighting. The Jews were fighting each other, the Italians were fighting each other, all this internal warfare. And Luciano realized that was bad for business. So he also saw the handwriting on the wall that Prohibition was going to be going out.
So he's a future-oriented executive.
Right. He's very much like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. He knows exactly. He's a genius.
Right.
So what he decides to do is to reorganize, to finally organize the Italian families into solid groups. And what he does is, based a lot on what had gone on in Sicily, which he knew about the families and the what they called brigadas groups, he organized the first 5 families in New York. And he had a major national convention in a hotel in Chicago in 1931. There were about 25 different organizations.
This is corporate. Go ahead.
He brought them all in and he said, look, these are the rules and this is how we're going to operate. And he also did one other wrinkle, which the Sicilians had never thought of. He created something called the Commission. And the idea behind the Commission was this was a board of directors. If there were internal or external feuds with each other, they would resolve it. And immediately, the first 5 members of the Commission were the New York Godfathers. Show you, they were the epicenter.
Okay.
We became
so
the epicenter.
New York is the
from the
center,
beginning.
From the beginning. And it was very conscious.
Right, and they knew, and they were responsible. They could veto or authorize anybody else to sit on the Commission. And the Commission set nationwide policies.
So we're talking about, is this a truly national syndicate,
Yes.
or is it located in various regions?
No, there were families throughout. There were roughly 25 to 26 families from the coast to coast.
Okay.
Mainly in those days, in the early 30s, in big cities, of course.
Right.
And what happened then was the Commission, which you always met in New York and everything else, the Commission would set policies like whether or not they should go into drugs, whether or not they should do this, who was right in a feud between 2 families, say, over Las Vegas, or anything else. The idea was they were peacemakers.
Okay.
So in this way, there wasn't going to be any more of this internecine warfare where they'd kill each other and attract attention. Luciano didn't want that. He wanted a golden reign.
So, and what he does is he creates this corporate structure, and he organizes the business, looks to the future. They get out of Prohibition, they get out of bootlegging, and what do?
They went into everything. They went into, well, it was always, bread and butter has always been gambling since they started in 31. Gambling and loan sharking, one of the 2 things you'll never eradicate in the mob. And that's been their bread and butter. But they went in, they were a mirror image of capitalism. They went
Interesting concept here.
Right.
Explain that a little bit.
They went in, they saw the labor unions were very important in a way of, in the construction industry, in the garbage collection industry, in the apparel industry, anything you did, if you controlled the unions, you could then get shakedown, and you could blackmail, in effect, the companies for peace, for labor peace.
Okay.
So this is one way they got into all of this. So the unions was a major element.
Okay.
But the point is, what set aside the Italian families from the old rivals, the Jewish and the Irish, was the Italians had a frame of structure, a structural frame. They had the code of omerta. They had a hierarchy.
Silence.
They had a hierarchy, which meant you had a boss, an underboss, and a consigliere, and the capos who ran the crews who did most of the work. And the idea was there was a principle behind all of this. The principle was that the organization is supreme to the individual. You could kill somebody, somebody would die naturally, the organization continued to flourish.
Right.
Unlike the Jewish and Irish gangs. If you took out the leaders there, and that still exists today in drug gangs.
Right.
They were finished. They were loosely knit. They never had any kind of table of organization.
So you've got this national commission that dominates all these criminal activities
from the
in
1930s to the 80s.
To the 80s,
and at least, and beyond.
And they buy off cops and judges and political officials. They control Tammany Hall.
And
they
politics, right?
They nominate.
They contribute
mayors.
money to in every big city: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia.
And this goes on for 50 years, and they get away with it? I mean, what is the FBI doing?
Nothing. One man who's mainly to blame is J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, okay.
Hoover had this great public relations aspect to him, which was almost all phony. What happened was, Hoover recognized very early in the 30s that tackling the Mafia was too hard. I've gone into the records, spoken to a lot of agents who worked with him back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And the problem was that the FBI, through the Vietnam War, was composed mainly of agents from small cities, rural guys from the South, the Midwest, had no concept of the culture of the Mafia. He realized he could never really infiltrate them, and he didn't want to infiltrate them. These guys would be made by the Mafia.
Too difficult.
Right. The other point was he was worried about bribery. He knew that they had a lot of money, and the same way they were bribing local people, they could bribe his people. And he had these other agenda that he found during World War II, was going after Nazi saboteurs. And the end of the war, he had this tremendous political agenda, communists, leftists. So he devoted his resources to that and didn't want to tackle them.
What about local prosecutors? I mean, doesn't Dewey make his name?
Well, it was an accident. Dewey made his name. He convicted in 1938. He convicted Lucky Luciano of all things promoting prostitution. Many people, and you can read it in my book, Five Families, who were there at the time, who reread it, and I read the trial transcript, saying there's no doubt Luciano was a mob boss, but he wasn't guilty of that crime. So he got him on that. And later on, there's been a lot of doubt about whether or not that conviction was really fair.
Okay, so let's move to the 80s, because in the 80s there's a breakthrough. There's a change in orientation, there's a change in law. What's going on in the 80s?
One man, a genius.
The counter-genius.
His name is G. Robert Blakey, better known as Bob Blakey, who had worked under the Kennedy administration in the 1960s for Bobby Kennedy when he was Attorney General, and had discovered all this. He was also interested in labor corruption, and he saw the connection, what was going on in the country. So what he did was, he and Senator John McClellan, late senator from a very tough guy from Arkansas, who didn't care about big city Democratic politics, so he could embarrass them. They decided to do two things. They passed two important laws. One was called Title III, which gave for the first time federal agents the right to really tap wires, tap telephones. The law previously had been you could intercept but not divulge. So Hoover had all these wiretaps, but he could never use it as courtroom evidence. He used it to spy on people. Anyway, they passed this new law, which for the first time in the 70s gave federal agents the right to intercept telephone conferences and use it, or bug people and use it in courts. But the most important thing was, the genius behind Robert Blakey, was he created this law known as RICO, Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act. He knew you had to get the hierarchies. You couldn't go for the minnows. Go after the sharks.
No individuals, organizations.
You have to knock out the organization if you are going to make any impact. And the way he did it was, for the first time, they made the conspiracy laws stronger. They changed the playing field. They changed the equation. If a boss was involved, even indirectly, in a crime, in two crimes.
Because it's a criminal enterprise under the law.
That was a pattern and a criminal enterprise. Now, this law gets passed in 1970, and nobody wants to use it. The prosecutors are afraid or dumb all over the country. Poor Blakey is going around like an itinerant preacher. He's proselyting, and nobody wants to listen to him. And for more or less, he finally convinced Rudy Giuliani, who had become, in the mid-70s, or in the early 80s, he had become the U.S. attorney for the Southern District, which is Manhattan, and which is in the epicenter of the Mafia. And Giuliani saw the power and the wisdom of that law. And they went after, the first big case was known as the Commission case, where they went after the heads of the 5 New York families. They were wrong about some of them. They got some of the wrong people. But they did knock out the hierarchies for the most part. This occurred in 1986. Now, there's a lot of controversy over Giuliani and his role in this Commission case, which he took, and He tried to get all the plaudits. The truth is, he was a catalyst. He didn't even prosecute the case.
Chertoff.
It was Michael Chertoff, who's now the Homeland Security.
Who's not very popular in the city these days.
Who was a very young lawyer
right.
at the time in the mid-'80s, and he prosecuted the case. So what this did, in one fell swoop, they knocked out...
They decapitated the
five
capos.
families. Yes, but what they did was they cleared the way for the next generation. Because, again, an example of Luciano's genius is that people came in and replaced them.
Upward mobility.
Right. They just got, better jobs.
So all of that legal jailing didn't have an impact?
It did. It did. For the first time, also, the FBI awoke, partly because of the proselytizing by Bob Blakey. He went around to FBI agencies, and they saw in New York what they had accomplished with the five families.
Right.
Suddenly, this law that nobody wanted, everybody thought was anathema, became the most favorite law in the country for federal prosecutors. You could get almost anybody.
So by the 90s, they're on the run. The most famous of the 90s mobsters, Gotti, and we haven't even talked about all the bloodshed. I mean, the bloodshed is here.
The other point was that the FBI, instead of relegating, at that time in the 80s and the 90s, Mafia to a low-level priority, made it number 1 or 2.
Okay.
It was counter-espionage was one, and very close was the Mafia.
Why this change in attitude? Why did the proselytizing work at that particular time?
Well, you saw it worked. I mean, for one thing, they could succeed. Nothing.
Oh, okay. They realized that they could succeed, so therefore they would do it.
There's nothing prosecutors like better than getting
winning.
notches on their belts, right? We're prosecuting these big guys, and they started prosecuting people all over the country.
I get it.
They saw how effective it was. You didn't have to be a genius.
Okay.
And the FBI devoted a lot of attention. Don't forget, a lot of the cases that come to U.S. attorneys or prosecutors come from the law enforcement people. So if the FBI is coming in with a case against Gotti or against Chin Gigante, they're going to go after it.
Okay.
If they come in with something else, they'll go after that.
Okay, so it looks by the end of the 90s, as you come into the new millennium, that the mobs are on the run. They've still got, as you point out, they've still got plenty of play. They've got their tentacles in a lot of places, but they're on the run, if not collapsed. And you argue in the book, the rise, decline, and resurgence. So you're saying they seem awful quiet. What's going on?
There's plenty in the pipeline. There's still cases that would go back to 99, 2000.
So you still have federal and state cases.
Oh yeah, but not very few state. It's
all fed.
The problem was, not problem, and perhaps justifiably, 9/11 changed the whole game plan.
Go ahead.
Counterterrorism became the most important priority.
So you're pulling people off.
They pulled off before 9/11. At one point in the late 90s, there was something like 350 FBI agents just in New York working full time on the Mafia, plus 100 cops, or what they call investigators. So you had almost 500 people working full time. That number is down now to about 50.
Now, given you...
So, I mean, you can see what are 50 people going to do. And remember the numbers that they're dealing with. The five families in New York, the largest five families in the country, have a total of about 1,000 made guys, 1,000 members. And the usual equation is that for every soldier, there's 5 associates or wannabes or people trying to help them. So you've got to deal with almost 6,000 people in the metropolitan area.
Wow, and you don't
How do you do it?
Right. So you're convinced that this danger is real, that they are involved in at least some of the same activities they've been involved in.
As an example,
they have new ones?
The World Trade Center. I wasn't able to document it in the book, but I will document it in a second edition, which will be out in the fall. It's now been shown that when the World Trade Center cleanup, getting rid of everything, the Mafia connections were involved in firms that were involved in the cleanup.
Removing
$60 million worth of contracts. And you don't think they got a piece of that? Plus, we know, it's in the book too, in Five Families, they try to steal the scrap metal.
Right, and sell it.
And one of their boy wonders, a guy by the name of Crayer, Wonder Boy Steve Crayer, was indicted only 2 years ago and convicted of shaking down one of the companies that was involved in the cleanup.
Yeah,
so they're all over.
And in fact, there is a piece in this week's New Yorker Online that talks about mob influence on the waterfront.
They haven't lost the influence.
So
on the
there,
waterfront.
what are the new targets of opportunity? I mean, are there any Luciano geniuses? Junior Gotti does not fit the Luciano genius. No. I mean, come on, we've got bad gangsters.
Junior Gotti is a has-been. He's through.
I mean,
in fact, he claims he resigned.
Do we have any?
Yeah, there's still smart guys like Steve Crayer, and there's a guy by the name of Liborio Barney Bellomo, who just was come out of prison next year, but just been re-indicted.
But these guys aren't the romantic guys of TV and the movies. These guys are thugs,
they're
right?
Thugs. They're killers.
I mean, that's the one thing that you keep emphasizing here, if not in words, but by their actions, that there's nothing nice, there's nothing romantic.
No.
Forget about The Godfather. Forget about the sensitivity.
Don't
in The
glorify
Sopranos.
them.
They're thugs.
Don't glorify them.
They're thugs.
They're all killers.
Okay.
And they're all willing to kill.
I know that was the frightening thing. I mean, you see it in books and movies, some of Nick Pileggi's stuff.
It's intimidation.
Goodfellas.
Their major weapon is intimidation.
It's terror.
You come
They're
over,
terrorists.
you tell a contractor, listen, you want this contract, this is what you got to do.
Okay. Let's move away from the Mafia for a minute and go to you. And what was striking in researching this is that you, as a reporter, even before you got to the Times, had not only did you write the news, or report the news rather, but you created the news. I remember Kojak. I remember the pilot at Kojak. It was the story of George Whitmore, and I didn't realize until I, read the background material on you that you were involved with that. Talk about that Whitmore case and how you sort of, as a journalist, became an advocate.
Well, I covered criminal justice in addition to the mob. What happened, very simply, there was this heinous murder in 1963 called the Wiley Hoppet murder, known as the Career Girl murders. 2 women living on the...
I remember as a kid,
it terrified the city. Yeah.
Terrified.
And about 5 months later, this black kid, teenager, who was 18 years old, was picked up because he had volunteered some information about a crime in Brooklyn. And they picked him up, and I have to say, one of the most stupid police detectives in New York questioned him, and they fed him information. They gave him a 63-page... He issued a 63-page confession, which the chief of detectives at the time said provided details only the killer could know. It was all made up. They threatened him, they beat him up, they scared him, and what happened was it was a very hard case to exonerate him. I went down, I found his alibi. He was very lucky that the murders occurred on August 28th, 1963, the day of the Martin Luther King speech and parade and rally in Washington. So I found about a dozen witnesses in his hometown of Wildwood, which was about 150 miles from New York, who could place Whitmore there on that day. No way he could have gotten to New York.
But how come it took you to find this out?
Yeah, well,
the defense attorney didn't. What's the story?
It was a hard case. The defense attorney didn't want to buck, especially, they didn't want to buck Frank Hogan, who was a little bit like J. Edgar Hoover at the time. I was condemned for even investigating.
He was the Manhattan
DA. Right, and the murders were in Manhattan. So what happened was Hogan found out who had really committed the murders. But he didn't want to exonerate Whitmore because he was afraid that would tip off the real killer. So he held him, and he allowed him to get convicted on a secondary charge, and they threw the book at him in Brooklyn, 8 years, and it took about 7 years to find another alibi on the second crime that he didn't commit, and we found, when I was at Channel 13 at the time with NET, we found his convincing alibi. Someone who...
And then he was released.
He was released right away.
And in fact, the Kojak pilot, which I remember because I was doing my doctoral exams, really lays it out in a fictionalized version. They changed the names, but everybody who saw that knew that was the Wiley Moffat murder. The other case that you were involved in is the Reuben Hurricane Carter case. Talk a little bit about that. Again, you having a very direct involvement in the case.
Well, I got involved in the Hurricane Carter case because of the Whitmore case. Newsweek and Time magazine did big stories about me in the press section.
Yeah, you were on the front page. Right. I mean, not too many crime reporters get on the front page.
Well, I consider it criminal justice, not crime.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, that's true. I'm sorry.
But in any event, what happened was Carter had been convicted with another man by the name of John Artis in the mid-60s in Paterson, New Jersey, of killing 3 white people in a bar, and had to do, and the theory was it was a racial retaliation for the murder of a black bar owner. Anyway, these people came to me and they read the story in the news magazine and said, "We've got to do something about him." What I did was I read the trial transcript, This is always better than footwork, and then do your footwork. And I saw in the trial transcript, it was actually, he was convicted on the evidence of 2 admitted criminals who were making deals to get off. And I looked at what they claimed they had seen that night, and I could see, just going to the scene of the crime, that one of them was lying. There was no way. He claimed he was in the midst of a burglary down the street, and he could see Carter and this other defendant, John Artis, come out. No way, impossible. So I was at 13 at the time, so we started digging into it, and we finally got 2 recantations from the one who we knew didn't see anything, and from a second eyewitness identification who was lying.
That must have been a professional thrill for you to have dug this all out and actually led to the exoneration of innocent folks.
Unfortunately, Hurricane Carter didn't like... There was a movie made, The Hurricane, which was totally a myth about how he had been really... the evidence had been found by reporters and by lawyers, and they created this phony story about some Canadians from a community.
But you know that way they have to sell tickets.
So they did it that way. Totally false.
Last minute, Tony Soprano. Your thoughts?
He's a joke. He wouldn't last 5 minutes as a real mafioso.
Go ahead.
The reason is, look, how many scenes have you been witness to where he walks out in his pajamas and
picks up the newspaper?
Picks up the newspaper, asking. He sits around cafes all the time. Easy mark. He could bump him off without any problem. Also, you see him riding around by himself. No bodyguards, for the most part. And he acts so silly. Not the way. And he, as a capo or as a boss, would never commit any crimes. That's the whole point of being a hierarch. You're not supposed to commit crimes.
Right.
But he goes out, he commits murders, he does all these things. So, look, it's good entertainment, but bad history.
Okay. Then, given his carelessness, he should get whacked at some point in the show.
Well, maybe it's not. Well, we'll see.
We'll see. It's my pleasure. One last thing, 30 seconds. What are you working on?
I just finished an epilogue to 5 Families.
Okay, which happens after when?
Yeah, well, the book was actually, I finished all the writing in the spring of 2005. So I've updated what's happened over the last
because that's
18
more than
months.
a year, right?
And a lot of things. People have died. The Gotti case has come. The Joe Messina case, the Bonanno family head. Also, what happened, with the Mafia cops trial, which is a big part of it.
Oh, okay.
They and the Lucchese family.
Okay, wait a minute. We have to stop now. But the Mafia cops case. Next time you come on, we'll talk about the epilogue when you get it published. You're welcome back. You're coming back.
My honor, sir.
Thank you.